Hi everybody. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about nesting interventions and cohort studies, and in particular about our work in Generation Victoria, or GenV as we call it, down in the state of Victoria in Australia. So about 10 years ago, we came together as a whole campus, the Melbourne Children's Campus, and asked the question, how can we as a campus help to solve the complex issues facing our children and adults now and in the future? And recognizing that the big issues that we are facing are both varied and local and global in nature, and also thinking about the role of bringing in genomics into some of those solutions. So if we fast forward 10 years, GenV is now a reality. We began recruiting in October of last year, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what it actually is. It is a whole of Victoria cohort targeting all 150,000 babies born over 2 years. And in Victoria, we have an annual birth cohort of around 75 to 80,000 babies. So all babies over 2 years and their parents as individuals. So it's a cross-generational cohort. Here you see a timeline from January 2020 through to January 2025, launched against the backdrop of pandemic lockdowns. We began our vanguard at a single hospital in December 2021. We began scaling up to all hospitals in May of last year, and from October of last year, all babies in the state became eligible. And what that means is that over a period of 3.5 years, pregnancies will be entering GenV, the main cohort here you see over the 2 years, and then children getting older over time. So in terms of where we're up to at the moment, this is a map of Victoria, and each of those dots represents a birthing hospital and therefore also a community. Just snipped a little bit of the west of Victoria. This is Melbourne down here with the big cluster of birthing hospitals. So 60 birthing hospitals, that's every hospital, 7 days a week recruitment, working in agreements with all of Victoria's pathology providers to bring in residual antenatal samples and also collecting newborn samples, so the newborn blood spot, saliva, breast milk and infant stool. So far we've recruited around 20,000 babies, which is around 50,000 participants, including the parents, of whom about 1 in 5 are based in regional Victoria, and around 1 in 5 have a primary spoken language, which is not English, which is about the proportions that we would expect for our population as a whole. Here you can see some of our recruiters. This is at the launch of one of our big hospitals. This is our CEO, Catherine North, and this is the Minister in the Victorian Government responsible for research at that launch. And I show this photo because authorisation is central both to GenV and we think to its future impact. So really on the slide, really just drawing your attention to the importance of extensive authorisation, particularly by the government, but also champions, hospitals, programs, pathology providers, and as time goes forward, communities, schools, educational systems, etc., all of which we hope will be part of the authorising fabric of GenV that makes it happen, but more importantly helps the translational outcomes to happen. So coming back to what is GenV, we talk about the 6 building blocks. I've already mentioned the consented cohort and the universal biosamples. The third building block is linked administrative and services data. Then there's GenV specific collected data, the idea of integrated studies, which is where trials and registries sit. And then this very important idea of building GenV with a platform as a service to become part of the learning systems that we were discussing yesterday. So just to touch on the linked administrative and services data, there are a number of different sources, things like births, deaths and marriages, but in particular we are focusing on the curated data sets held at both state and federal level, uncurated data such as through electronic medical records, pharmacies, schools, other services, and also unstructured data as well, such as images and digital objects, all of which we hope to bring together to create the GenV Enduring Linked Data Asset. And just touching on the idea of the platform as a service, this will come in the future, but the idea is that we think about all of the different groups that may want to benefit from and use GenV data. So in the fullness of time, the children, the parents, researchers, obviously, collaborators who can help us to build GenV, but also the public, the policymakers and the service providers, and potentially also a role for commercial companies. And all of this pulled together in a platform that adheres to the necessary systems and standards such as FAIR principles and the 5 safes. So children are underrepresented in registries and trials. That is universally acknowledged, and it's also acknowledged that registries and trials and a wide range of other interventional designs are really critical to better outcomes. And if we think about a very large whole of state platform or study or cohort like GenV, it's a bit like this piñata. As that whole population moves forward over time, those children and those parents will represent everything in that population. So we could look at, for instance, these blue lollies as potentially being different health conditions. The yellow lollies might be different particular minority groups or groups with particular needs. Black might represent different mental health issues. Another colour might represent different communities. All of those will become represented in GenV. And there is both the opportunity, I think, and also the challenge, because we don't know yet what questions will come to GenV or who will actually provide the driving force to power up their research, if you like. With that in mind, we are actively designing GenV for intervention as well as observation, with the really important idea that children really can't wait. So we've done quite a bit of thinking about how to integrate trials into whole population cohort. There's many challenges. You can read about this in our published paper in BMC Medical Research Methodology, and also a summary of some of the thinking in the perspective in Neil and Shirley's special edition in Pediatrics last month. But in essence, why test interventions in a very large cohort like GenV? Well, one cohort can support many trials, reducing time, participant, financial and regulatory burdens. Secondly, stacked trials can mimic real life. So through life, children experience many interventions. They may see their doctor, they go to school, they have childcare, they have babysitters, they go through life with their parents. So many interventions that children experience naturally over time that are experienced together or sequentially. And GenV can mimic that. Thirdly, trial effect sizes may generate more realistic intervention population estimates than cohort estimates, which typically vastly overestimate what can be achieved through an intervention. Fourthly, trials can access prior data, so we are often left with questions in trials or interventions about why some people responded differently from others, and that really relies on having information from before a person reached the point of receiving that intervention. And also long-term outcomes. So the typical horizon for an intervention or trial in a research paradigm is a year or 3 years. But actually, we might be most interested in the intervention for a preterm infant, how it plays out when they become adults, entering employment and other outcomes like that. And a cohort like GenV can potentially really provide those long-term outcomes that trials simply can't. And lastly, trials could shift their focus from the one-dimensional health interventions, the kind of silver bullet, single system approach, to the myriad environmental, social, and economic determinants that underpin the bulk of health and prosperity. So what we're trying to do with GenV as we think about generating solutions for the first 2,000 days is to weave this idea of trials into the entire fabric of GenV, along with registries, health services research, public health, geospatial, health economics, and going through all of these different stages of life. So one of the things that immediately presents itself is what should we measure? And if you look at cohort studies, they are really dominated by deep, rich exposure measures, very detailed. If we are to fit GenV for trials and interventions, then we need to focus on outcomes from the very outset. And that presents a challenge if we don't yet know what those trials will be. So to guide us in selection of the most important outcomes, we've turned to the idea of core outcome sets, which are minimum sets of outcomes for clinical trials in a particular area. And they are rigorously developed to reflect the priorities of individuals, families, and services, not just researchers. So last year we undertook a systematic review of all core outcome sets for pregnancy, newborns, young children, and adults in the period of in the parent age group. In the belief that the core outcome sets would present a transparent approach to outcome selection, not just for longitudinal studies, but also for the trials we want to conduct. And these are what this Wordle shows, the kind of range of outcomes that floated to the top. And what you can see here is that although there are a number of quite medical outcomes, largely the outcomes are issues that are important to everybody, regardless of whether you have a rare condition like Hirschsprung's disease or a common condition like pregnancy itself. So we can see here things like growth and weight, physical function and disability, quality of life, mortality, obviously, cognitive function and ability, neurodevelopmental morbidity, all of these things that are so important to INRICH. And we're now working to build all of those into our measurement fabric. So where are we up to with trials at the moment? It's very early days. We've had a long period of wondering whether we can even get GenV off the ground. We now know that we can, but we've been recruiting for only 9 months and we still don't know what our final recruitment will be. And obviously uptake will dictate to a certain extent what GenV can support in the future. But here's 3 examples of early trials, 2 of which, Aeroplane and Optimum, are very much those unidimensional single question hypothesis driven trials. So Aeroplane is asking the very pragmatic question of, should we resuscitate late preterm babies in room air, which might not be as good for resuscitation, or 30% oxygen, which might mean they're more likely to end up in the special care nursery with iatrogenic costs and illnesses. And this is exciting, I think. It's our first trial and it's a multi-centre crossover trial in 20 Victorian units with special care nurseries, which wouldn't be possible without an enormous amount of money without GenV. As it is, it's almost cost-free. The second one, Optimum, is again testing a very straightforward question. If we use an acellular versus whole cell pertussis vaccine at 6 to 8 weeks, can we reduce allergy, and particularly food allergy, at 1 and 2 years? And again, this is a trial that's difficult to do without a study like GenV because it's very difficult to recruit that number of infants early enough to enter the trial. And then thirdly, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, and I'm sure Sharon would be happy to expand on it, our very first thinking about a major stacked early childhood development trial, really addressing many of the different issues that are dear to INRICH. So this comes from the current state of play in Victoria, where we know that 20% of children arrive at school developmentally vulnerable. We also know that despite that overall figure, some communities are much worse off than others. It's not an equal playing field. And this is despite increasing investment and despite a sufficient number of services in most communities. So Sharon is leading this thinking, really trying to move beyond the idea of the silver bullet. Could we work across 20 priority communities and deliver a trial, sorry, that's my timer telling me 15 minutes is up. Could we deliver an intervention where we test multiple different interventions, all of which we know have some efficacy by themselves, but together and collectively might move us much further along the road to true benefit and really equalising that gradient of inequality. So this is still in very early stages of thinking. It will involve co-design, a big emphasis on data and indicators, and we'll really need that platform I was telling you about earlier. And the whole idea of this is both to test, but also to drive systems improvement in a way that can then is already scaled, but can then be further scaled for sustainable system change. So lastly, not to forget that there are many other big issues, as I said before. And just to mention again that we launched GenV against this COVID backdrop. We're the only large cohort that we know that actually launched in the middle of the pandemic, with these incredible changes that happened with lockdowns easing, lockdowns easing, lockdowns, Omicron, and who knows what over coming months and years. And what this creates is this incredible fabric of natural experiments that could not have been put together in these combinations through any researcher designed randomized trial, in my view. So just taking 3 examples here, what happened to noise, air pollution and UV in every 3-month block over 2020 and 2021, there were enormous changes. And then against this, we have the 3-month tranches, if we want to look at it that way, of GenV, where the light green represents preconception, the middle green pregnancy, and the dark green the first 3 months of life, and then of course getting older. But with each 3-month slice of GenV, they're experiencing a different combination of changes in environmental, social, and policy drivers at different periods in this very early and plastic period of development. So we think that even without designing new interventions, there is just an enormous amount of quasi-interventional research that can be carried out within this data set using causal frameworks to analyse, really critical questions like, why did preterm birth suddenly halve? What were the benefits, what were the harms, and what was the drivers between those things actually happening? So huge opportunities there. And lastly, just to close with, again, coming back to the why of all this, these are data from our preceding child health checkpoint study embedded in the longitudinal study of Australian children from Fiona Mensah. What we can see here is a wide range of different measures of cognition, of physical phenotypes, of mental health, and of metabolic and molecular health. And what this graph shows is the difference in standard deviations between those in the highest and lowest quintile of SES. And you can see these enormous effects right across the board for all of these body systems and essentially every phenotype. And what is most chilling is that we see exactly the same patterns and incredibly sizable effects already embedded in our children across those 4 different body systems and those multiple phenotypes within the body systems. So as I said before, children can't wait. We are looking at GenV and studies like GenV as being powerful frameworks within which systems for change and evaluation can be embedded. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. You can see GenV evolving in our working papers and our published papers. I would like to thank everybody involved in GenV, obviously especially Sharon, who's here today, but GenV is the work of so very many people, and certainly the thinking about the interventions that could be embedded in it and potentially the drivers of interventions that could be embedded will likely come from outside GenV itself, and we really invite you all to think with us and put forward ideas to that end. So thank you very much.